So this brings up a question that I was going to save till later, but I think following what is now makes sense to ask, and it has to do with your thoughts on the movement around bringing psychedelics into palliative care. There's been some growing research over the last few years that working with psilocybin, which is the active agent in psilocybin mushrooms, for people who are terminally ill. I believe often all the research has been done with cancer, in the mindset that it gives them an opportunity to really enter into an unresistant, unconstrained encounter with everything that they're feeling about all of this, and to trigger some sort of encounter with the spiritual world in the midst of this unconstrained feeling process, and that the clinical results, and this is clinical psychotherapy along with these psychedelics. This isn't just by any means giving people the psychedelics hoping that opening them up is going to fix their dying problem or whatever. That the results are extremely positive for people being able to essentially go through the rest of their dying process with less antidepressants, less pain medication, not by any means none. But it seems to have a positive impact as well as on how they show up to their dying time, um, in a way that helps set the table, to paraphrase something that you've said in your movie Grief Walker, in a more, uh, for lack of better terms, a positive way. And I'm curious, of course, doing what you do, you're going to come in encounter with droves of people asking you about psychedelics and dying. And given the research and given the, say the underground interpretations of what psychedelics could do based on some, menial reading of the research, where do you see that something like that could fit inside of the current deathphobic culture and palliative care institutions that we have in the modern world?
Well, first of all, I haven't read the stuff, so there was a part to your characterization, and obviously it's not your work. You're referring to things that you've read and so on. So I'm not holding you to account for it.
Hmm.
But there's a piece missing at the end of your characterization. Something along the lines of, so, and if you take it and then it'll open you up to the da 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 da. So that what? No, that's the question. So that what happens? So that you have a bigger, deeper. But these are all neutral descriptors. What? Why is that a goal? Bigger, deeper, longer. Uh, you know, I wonder what's the end game of this psilocybin enhanced encounter. What's it for? So that's the first thing, and I can't answer that. But I can intuitively guess. Why there's so many takers for this kind of thing now,
Mm.
and it would be something along these lines, just like euthanasia and half a dozen other things I could think of off the top of my head. Psychedelics are being embraced by a deathphobic culture. That should tell you something. Just that piece of information. Psychedelics are being embraced by a deathphobic culture when its citizens are approaching their death. Does that mean that by virtue of the availability of psilocybin, that the death phobia of the culture is dissolved? Could it be at least not as likely that the advent of psilocybin is an attribute of the undissolved death phobia of the culture that is increasingly championing its availability? That would be my question.
Mm.
And it's a little more than a question. Obviously, it's a kind of shit disturbing
Right.
detail that I linger over because let me tell you a little story, and then maybe me making that case becomes a little self-evident as to why. I was in New York maybe 2 years ago or three, and I was asked to present at a conference called The Art of Dying. Now, I'm quite sure that if they had to call the thing dragging your ass through the worry and the slurry of the ending of days, they wouldn't have had a lot of people there. If they had had a phrase, a title that in any way did justice to the ongoing realities of dying, they wouldn't have had many takers. And they knew that. So they called it The Art of Dying instead. And immediately if you call it that, you've turned it into something that is fundamentally decorative, life enhancing, aesthetically compelling, just to choose three. So there I was, and I went second on the first morning. So the lady before me was obviously of the crowd-pleasing variety, and they chose well to begin with her instead of with me. And I sat in the front row, and I waited my turn. And as she went along, she was digging for me a hole, as people who come before you can do, because they're establishing a certain, let's say, vibe in the audience, a certain degree of expectation of what should be following them by virtue of the material they present and how they present it, and the kind of unspoken assumptions and prejudices that are there. And she did so. And one of the things that struck me is about half of the way through, she was making the case that her alternative universe, parallel reality, self-appointed death care working brigade, credential-free brigade. I could go on, but you get the idea. And these people have all arisen out of the ether in the last 10 or 15 years as fundamentally self-appointed experts to eclipse the old expertise. She was describing on behalf of these people, many of whom were in the audience, the inevitable upside of this development. And to summarize the entire thing, she literally raised her hands in a kind of a victory salute and shouted basically, "We're going mainstream," she said. And everybody in the place basically rose up as if they were at a Tony Robbins seminar and, said amen at the top of their lungs. And before you know it, the music is rising, and all of that kind of thing. And I'm sitting there in the front row thinking, Jesus Christ, this is lunacy. Mm. But anyway, I quietly waited my turn, and at some point in my offering, one of the things I asked is whether or not anyone who was in favor of going mainstream in this regard ever wondered what happened to all the other things that went mainstream before them. Anything that went mainstream before them. What was it before it went mainstream? And the answer is, more often than not, it was dangerous, it was deeply alternative, it was troubled and troubling at the same time, and it was willing to take chances. And the nanosecond you go mainstream and get funding and all of that stuff, man, all those attributes are gone. Of course they're gone. Anyone with a conscience knows that these things disappear the nanosecond the government funds you, or private industry, or the insurance realm funds you, or whatever it is. Enough people say yes to you, it's because you're easy to say yes to. So what's my point in all this? It's this. When a death-phobic culture generates solutions to death phobia, you can be absolutely certain that the goal of these measures is not to diminish or dissolve the death phobia. You can be sure that on the other side of the adoption of these measures, the death phobia is in fact intact, fully functioning, and has absorbed this latest, greatest alternative in a way that pretends to be offering alternatives, as any consumer culture will do, and at the same time keeping in good working order the culture and or the orientation that produced the longing for it in the first place. And interestingly enough, by doing so, they create greater longing for it. Right? So the longing comes from what's missing in the culture. And psilocybin looks like, quote, something that's missing in the culture. It's not, of course. The having resort to psychedelics, just to take that example, is a consequence of what's missing in the culture. And what's missing in the culture is not mysteriously present, because you get to have a drug at the end of your life. it's still missing. And
Hmm.
this is what makes that stuff so compelling. And an alternative to, I don't mean to take over the discussion here. I'll stop in a second, but a good parallel to that is the advent of the notion that suicide is a personal right, much in the same way that, quote unquote, identity or gender politics is a personal right to declare and to self-identify, and nobody has anything to say about it. It's all yours to dial it in and to hold it up and to champion it, and no one has the right to wonder about it or question you or question your insistence of uh, disfiguring the language fundamentally to come up with bizarre pronouns that everybody's supposed to pretend are meaningful. I could go on. The point that I'm making here is suicide, when it is elevated and enthroned as a personal right, as an expression of personal freedom, is another juvenile gesture. Because what it does is it guarantees that you will not be there to taste the consequences of the exercise of your right. Everyone else will be there. Everyone who didn't exercise their right to self annihilate, they'll be there. They'll be living the consequence of what you put into motion. They'll be living the indictment that you left behind, whether you left behind a suicide note or not. Everyone else will be on the receiving end of the consequences of what you've done, but not you. Does that still sound like a right? Or does it sound something perilously close to self indulgence,
Hmm.
instead masquerading as something that God wants you to have for yourself?
Hmm. Um, jumping back a little bit, I really appreciate your comments there on suicide. As I said, being in the midst of the consequences of somebody taking that right to themselves. I mean, it was a complicated situation because they were in the midst of a psychotic episode.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but going back to your discussions about psychedelics there, and especially the idea that going mainstream is some sort of positive step for an
Mm-hmm.
alternative culture. And of course, when it comes to the research and the actions of the people around the psilocybin assisted psychotherapy research, especially in the dying field, from the people who I've spoken to, their main concern is in many ways the reduction of suffering and to offer people a greater spaciousness in their dying time, and that space um, giving them opportunities for more grace. As you said, there is something missing in the culture, and by virtue of psilocybin arriving, that thing that is missing does not mysteriously appear. And at the same time, it seems like for many people, that psilocybin helps to maybe unravel a little bit of the consequences of that not being there for them, enough so that they can die something closer to a mhm, a well died death. I don't know if that's great. That's great info or grammar there. So I see. I really I do invite you to look at the research and the intentions behind the researchers. As the ones that I've met don't seem to be about. They seem to be very clear on what death phobia is doing in palliative care, and are hoping to shift that in some way. And actually, your comment about mainstream, especially with psychedelics, this is one of the reasons why I have yet to, despite everybody recommending me to, reading Michael Pollan's new book on psychedelics, because he created a mainstream narrative for it, and I'm not interested in being a part of the Michael Pollan mainstream psychedelic narrative. I'm interested in staying deep in the alternative and pushing the edges, not rounding my edges out so that I can fit into the mainstream parade. Um, and I'm going to give you just an opportunity to respond to that if you like, and then I'd like to move on to another question.
I'm not talking about, in my comment about this, I prefaced it by saying, I haven't read the stuff.
Hmm.
I'm not going to read the stuff. It's not something that compels or interests me in any way. I don't take any pride in that. I'm just acknowledging that
Hmm.
there's only so many hours in the day, only so many days in a lifetime, and it's proper to decide what you're going to do with them.
Agreed.
So there's that. I don't say that with any arrogance. I simply am not compelled by the stuff. But with that in mind, I simply say this. Whatever the motivations are of the people who are doing the research and doing the practice, I come back to the lamentable observation that if taking a drug is the difference between depth and glibness, if that's what it's come down to, I'm happily on the outside of that whole thing. That's what I'm saying. This is not an anti-drug thing per se that I'm saying. What I'm saying is, when it's that easy and that available, I'm wondering why the measures are not being taken to address the circumstance that eventually appears to make the availability of the drug necessary as a comfort-giving, suffering-reducing proposition.
Mm.
Because the problem is, on the other side of that solution, baby, all the suffering is still there. Everything that made it suffering is still there. And the kind of culture level labor that should be devoted to wondering from whence comes the suffering remains undone, unimagined, and there seems to be no sense of kind of responsibility to the generations to come to take this work on, simply to make another drug available and imagine that that's the least you can do for the people who are coming after you. Sound like more of the same to me. And there's the suffering washing up on shore with all that plastic for another generation.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I'm on board with you on definitely on some things there, especially, that it's like it's not changing the way things are that's causing these issues. Although from personal experience, I can assure you that an encounter with psilocybin is by no means an easy one, or one that brings the alleviation of suffering through the drug action, so much as it is possibly some relief at the end of it for the hours and hours you spent encountering all the suffering you've been hiding from your whole life. So leaving that there, not to by any means sort of like make my word the last word, but I would like to move on to a different topic.